In the mud and chaos of a World War II battlefield, a medic knelt beside a fallen soldier. As he searched for identification, his fingers brushed against something unexpected, a crumpled piece of paper, carefully tucked beneath the young man's uniform. What he found would move him to tears and change how we understand the true cost of war. But this letter wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't a goodbye note or a final confession. What it contained was so powerful that it would haunt this medic for the rest of his life. And when you hear what was written inside, it might change how you see courage forever. Picture this. It's October 1944. Somewhere near the German border in the Hürtgen Forest, one of the bloodiest and most brutal battlefields of World War II. The sounds of artillery have finally quieted after 3 days of relentless fighting, and rescue teams are combing through the aftermath of another devastating battle. The forest floor is carpeted with fallen leaves mixed with something far more tragic, the bodies of young men who would never see home again. Among the fallen lies a 19-year-old private from a small farming town in Ohio. His name was James Patrick Sullivan, and like so many boys of his generation, he'd left behind a life of simple pleasures, high school football games, Saturday nights at the local diner, dreams of taking over his father's farm someday. But in his final moments, James was clutching something precious, something that would reveal the extraordinary heart beating inside this ordinary farm boy. This isn't just another war story about heroes and battles. This is about the deeply personal moments that remind us that behind every uniform was a son, a brother, a dreamer with hopes that stretched far beyond the battlefield. It's about how human goodness can survive even in humanity's darkest hour. What makes this story extraordinary isn't just the letter itself, it's what that letter reveals about the choices we make when everything around us falls apart. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this single piece of paper became one of the most powerful testimonies of World War II, why it changed the life of every person who read it, and why its message is more relevant today than ever before. You'll also discover the incredible journey this letter took to finally reach its intended destination, a journey that took 18 years and involved a promise that one man refused to break. The medic who found James Sullivan that day was Corporal Michael Chin, a 22-year-old from San Francisco who'd been trained to save lives. Not to read the final thoughts of the dying, but as his hands shook while unfolding that letter, he had no idea he was about to encounter something that would define the rest of his existence. The letter was found tucked not in James's pocket, but pressed against his chest, underneath his dog tags. The paper was worn from being folded and unfolded countless times, stained with mud, rain, and something else that made Chen's hands tremble as he began to read. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the kind of penmanship that spoke of a boy who'd been raised to take his time and think before he wrote. It began simply, "Dear Mom and Dad, I don't know if I'll ever send this, but I need to write it down. There are things happening here that I need you to understand, and things I need to tell you before whatever happens next." What followed was unlike anything Chen had ever encountered in his months of treating wounded soldiers. James wasn't writing about the horrors of war, about the enemies he'd faced, or even about being scared to die. Instead, he was writing about something entirely unexpected: hope. "I know you're probably worried sick about me," James continued, "and I know the newspapers back home are full of terrible stories about what's happening over here. But I need you to know that even in this awful place, I've seen things that would make you proud of the world we're fighting for." James went on to describe a moment that had happened just days before his death. His unit had been advancing through a small French village that had been evacuated months earlier. The buildings were mostly destroyed, windows blown out, walls pockmarked with bullet holes. It looked like a ghost town, but as they moved through the ruins, they heard something impossible: the sound of crying. Following the sound, they discovered a cellar where an elderly French couple had been hiding with their granddaughter, a little girl no more than 5 years old. The couple, Henri and Marie Dubois, had been too frail to evacuate with the rest of the village, and they'd been surviving on scraps and rainwater for weeks. What James described next revealed everything about the kind of person he was. While his fellow soldiers secured the area, James spent hours with this family. He shared his rations, gave them his own blanket, and somehow, despite speaking no French, managed to communicate with the little girl through gestures and drawings in the dirt. Dad, you should have seen her face when I showed her how to make a paper airplane from one of my letters. James wrote. It was the first time she'd smiled in months, according to her grandfather. And when she laughed, Dad, it was like hearing church bells on Christmas morning. It reminded me why we're here, why this matters. But the letter revealed something even more profound. James wrote about how his fellow soldiers had reacted to finding this family. Without hesitation, they'd all contributed something: extra food, clean water from their canteens, a medic's bandages for Henry's infected cut. One soldier, a tough guy from Brooklyn named Tony, had even given the little girl his lucky rabbit's foot, telling her through gestures that it would keep her safe. These guys, Mom, they're not the rough, heartless soldiers you might imagine. They're boys like me. And when they saw that little girl's tears, every single one of them became a big brother. It made me realize that no matter how dark things get, people are still fundamentally good. James's letter then took an even more personal turn. He wrote about his bunkmate, Tommy Rodriguez from El Paso, Texas. Tommy was only 18, the youngest in their unit, and he carried a photo of his little sister Rosa everywhere he went. The photo was creased and faded from being pulled out and looked at hundreds of times. Tommy talks about Rosa every night. James wrote, she's turning 12 next month, and he's been saving up his pay to buy her a bicycle for her birthday. He shows everyone her picture and tells us about how she wants to be the first person in their family to go to college. Tommy's been writing her letters every single day, telling her about the importance of education, about staying in school, about believing in herself. Then James revealed something that made Corporal Chen stop reading and wipe his eyes. Tommy had been killed 3 days before James wrote the letter. But it wasn't just that Tommy had died, it was how he died that revealed the extraordinary character of these young men. Their unit had been advancing through a bombed-out building when they triggered a hidden explosive. Tommy had been the first to see it, the first to realize what was about to happen. In the split second he had to react, Tommy threw himself forward, not away from the blast, but toward it, shielding 3 other soldiers with his own body. In his last moments, James wrote, Tommy looked right at me and said, tell Rosa I kept my promise. Tell her I was brave. Mom, Dad, he wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about his little sister, about the example he wanted to set for her, about the brother he wanted to be remembered as. James went on to describe how the entire unit had been affected by Tommy's sacrifice. They'd held an impromptu memorial service that night, and each soldier had written a letter to Rosa Rodriguez, telling her about her brother's courage, his kindness, his dreams for her future. We're going to make sure she gets that bicycle, James wrote. Every one of us contributed money, and Lieutenant Morrison is going to personally make sure it reaches her, because that's what Tommy would have done for any of us. But perhaps the most powerful part of the letter was what came next. James wrote about a conversation he'd had with his squad leader, Sergeant William Hayes, a career soldier who'd been fighting since Pearl Harbor. Hayes had found James sitting alone after Tommy's funeral, staring at the stars. You know what the hardest part of this job is, Sullivan? Hayes had asked. It's not the fighting. It's not even the dying. It's holding on to the reasons why we're here in the first place. James wrote about how Hayes had then shared something he'd never told anyone. Before the war, Hayes had been an elementary school teacher in Kansas. He'd had a classroom full of kids who looked up to him, who trusted him to prepare them for the world. When he'd enlisted after Pearl Harbor, he'd promised himself that every decision he made, every action he took, would be something he could explain to those kids someday. Sergeant Hayes told me something I'll never forget. James continued in his letter. He said, the moment you stop seeing the humanity in others, whether they're your allies or your enemies, that's the moment you lose the war that really matters, the war for your own soul. This conversation had clearly affected James deeply, because the rest of his letter was filled with examples of how he and his fellow soldiers were trying to hold on to their humanity in the midst of inhumanity. He wrote about Private Anderson from Minnesota, who'd been carrying around packets of candy for weeks. looking for children to give them to. He wrote about Corporal Martinez from California, who'd learned basic German phrases not for interrogation, but so he could offer comfort to wounded enemy soldiers. Yesterday, we found a German soldier, couldn't have been older than 16, wounded and calling for his mother, James wrote. Martinez sat with him for 2 hours, holding his hand and speaking softly in his broken German, until the boy died peacefully. Martinez didn't speak for the rest of the day. When I asked him why he'd done it, he said, "Because somebody's mother is never going to see her son again, and the least I could do was make sure he didn't die alone." James then revealed something that showed the depth of his own character. He'd been keeping a journal throughout his service, but not the kind of journal you might expect. Instead of recording battles and strategies, he'd been documenting acts of kindness, both given and received. "I've filled 2 notebooks so far," he wrote, with stories about soldiers sharing their last cigarette with a wounded enemy, about medics risking their lives to save civilians, about boys who left home as farm kids and mechanics becoming heroes in ways they never imagined. He wrote about the time their unit had discovered a group of German civilians, mostly elderly people and children, who'd been cut off from their own forces and were starving. Despite orders to avoid unnecessary contact with civilians, the entire unit had voted to share their rations. "We spent our Christmas Eve of 1943 teaching German children how to play American card games," James wrote. "None of us spoke their language, and they didn't speak ours. But laughter sounds the same in every language. For a few hours, we weren't American soldiers and German civilians. We were just people, sharing what little we had." But James also wrote honestly about the struggles he and his fellow soldiers faced in maintaining their humanity. He described nights when the horror of what they'd seen would overwhelm them, when some of the men would break down crying, when others would become so angry they'd have to be physically restrained. "There's a darkness here, Mom and Dad," James admitted, "a darkness that tries to convince you that cruelty is normal, that violence is the only answer, that the person across from you isn't really human. I've felt that darkness trying to take hold of me, but every time it does, I remember something you taught me, Dad. You told me that a man's character isn't defined by what he does when things are easy. It's defined by who he chooses to be when everything around him is falling apart." James then shared the story that would become the most famous part of his letter. It had happened just a week before he died. During a particularly brutal period of fighting, his unit had been pinned down for hours by enemy fire, with several men wounded and no clear way to retreat or advance. In the midst of this chaos, James had noticed movement in a shell crater about 30 yards away. Looking through his scope, he'd seen something that made his blood run cold: a young German soldier, probably the same age as Tommy, trying to bandage a severe wound on his leg. The German was clearly dying, alone and terrified. "I had a choice to make," James wrote. "I could have taken the shot. It would have been easy, and no one would have questioned it. But as I looked at this boy's face through my scope, all I could see was Tommy. All I could see was someone's son, someone's brother, dying alone and scared." What James did next defied every rule of warfare, every bit of training he'd received, every instinct for self-preservation. During a brief lull in the fighting, he'd crawled out of his position and made his way to the German soldier. "I don't know why I did it," James wrote. "Maybe it was Tommy's voice in my head, telling me to be brave. Maybe it was Sergeant Hayes reminding me about the war for my soul. Or maybe it was just you and Mom, and the way you raised me to help people who are hurting." When James reached the wounded German soldier, the boy had been too weak to even lift his weapon. Instead, he'd looked up at James with eyes full of terror and resignation. James had knelt beside him, and in that moment, had made a decision that would define the rest of his short life. Using his limited German and a lot of gestures, James had managed to communicate that he was there to help, not to harm. He'd used his own medical supplies to properly bandage the boy's wound, had given him water from his canteen, and had stayed with him until the boy's own unit had been able to retrieve him. As they carried him away, James wrote, "That German boy looked back at me and said something in English. It took me a moment to understand what he'd said, but when I did, I started crying right there in that shell crater. He'd said, "Danky, brother." The impact of this encounter on James was profound. He wrote about how his fellow soldiers had reacted when he'd returned to their position. Some had been angry, calling him foolish for risking his life for an enemy. Others had been confused, unable to understand why he'd done it. But Sergeant Hayes had pulled James aside later that night and said something that James would treasure until his death. "Sullivan, what you did today, that took more courage than charging a machine gun nest. Anyone can be brave when they're angry. It takes a special kind of person to be brave when they're being compassionate." James's letter then revealed the true purpose behind his writing. He'd been struggling with the fear that war would change him, that he'd return home as someone his parents wouldn't recognize. But his experience with the German soldier had shown him something important. "I want you to know," he wrote, "that no matter what happens to me over here, I haven't forgotten who you raised me to be. Every day, I try to help someone. Every day, I try to see the good in this terrible place. Every day, I remember that I'm your son first, and a soldier second. And if I don't make it home, I want you to know that I died as the same person who left your farm 2 years ago, maybe even a better person." The letter concluded with James's hopes for the future, both for himself and for the world. He wrote about his dreams of returning to Ohio, of taking over the family farm, of marrying his high school sweetheart, Sarah, and raising children who would never have to know the horror of war. "But if I don't get to live those dreams," he wrote, "I want you to know that they weren't wasted. Every act of kindness I've witnessed here, every moment of courage, every choice to be human instead of becoming a monster, those things matter. They're seeds of the world we're fighting to create." James ended his letter with a request that would break any parent's heart. "If something happens to me, please don't let my death make you bitter. Don't let it make you hate. Remember instead that I chose love, even here, even now. And please, find Tommy's sister Rosa. Tell her that her brother was the bravest person I ever knew, and that his courage made me want to be brave too." The letter was signed simply, "Your loving son, James. P.S. I still remember the taste of Mom's apple pie, and it's gotten me through more dark nights than you'll ever know." Corporal Chin sat in that muddy forest for nearly an hour after reading James's letter, tears streaming down his face. He'd been trained to deal with the physical wounds of war, but nothing had prepared him for this glimpse into the soul of courage. Chin carefully folded the letter and placed it in his medical bag, making a promise that would define the rest of his life. He was going to find James's parents, and he was going to make sure they received their son's final gift to them. But Chen's journey to fulfill this promise would prove to be almost as extraordinary as the letter itself. The war ended 8 months later, and Chen returned to his home in San Francisco, carrying James's letter with him. However, his attempts to locate the Sullivan family initially failed. The address James had written was rural route number, and the small Ohio town had undergone significant changes in the post-war boom. For 3 years, Chin wrote letters to postmasters, mayors, and newspaper editors throughout Ohio, trying to find James's family. He hired a private investigator with his own money. He even took his vacation time to drive through rural Ohio, stopping at every farm, showing James's photograph to anyone who would look. The breakthrough came in 1948, when Chen's letter to a small-town newspaper editor in Ohio was published as a human interest story. A reader recognized the name Sullivan and contacted the paper. James's parents, Robert and Margaret Sullivan, were still living on their farm, still hoping against hope that their son might somehow return home. When Chen finally arrived at the Sullivan farm on a crisp October morning in 1948, exactly 4 years after James's death, he found an elderly couple who had aged decades in the years since their son's departure. Margaret Sullivan was hanging laundry on the line, and Robert was repairing a fence post. They stopped their work when they saw the stranger approaching their front door. Chen later described that meeting as the most difficult and most important moment of his life. He sat at Margaret Sullivan's kitchen table, the same table where James had eaten thousands of meals, and slowly, carefully, he told them about their son's final days. He read them the letter word by word, stopping frequently as Margaret wept and Robert held her hand. But Chin had brought more than just the letter. Remember, James had written about Tommy Rodriguez and his promise to buy his sister Rosa a bicycle. Chin had spent months tracking down the other members of James's unit, and together, they had not only bought Rosa her bicycle, but had established a small scholarship fund in Tommy's name for promising Hispanic students. Chin had also located Henri and Marie Dubois, the elderly French couple James had helped in that bombed-out village. They had survived the war and were living with their granddaughter in a rebuilt version of their village. When Chin had written to them and told them about James's letter, they had sent back a package containing something precious, a drawing the little girl had made of the American soldier who had given her hope. The drawing showed a tall figure in a uniform, kneeling beside a much smaller figure, both of them smiling. At the bottom, in careful French lettering, she had written, Lang Américain, the American angel. But perhaps most remarkably, Chin had managed to track down the German soldier James had saved. His name was Klaus Weber, and he had survived the war and become a doctor in his hometown in Bavaria. When Weber learned about James's letter, he wrote his own letter to the Sullivan family, describing how James's act of compassion had changed his entire perspective on humanity and had inspired him to dedicate his life to healing rather than destroying. Your son saved more than my life that day, Weber wrote to the Sullivans. He saved my faith in the goodness of people. Every patient I have treated, every life I have saved as a doctor, exists because your son chose to see me as a human being rather than an enemy. Margaret Sullivan's response to Chen's visit became part of the letter's legend. After hearing everything, she was quiet for a long time. Then she stood up, walked to an old desk in the corner of the kitchen, and pulled out a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. These are all the letters James sent us during the war, she told Chen. Every single one of them talks about kindness he had witnessed or kindness he had shown. We always wondered if he was just trying to protect us from the horrible truth. But now I know, this was the horrible truth. That even in the worst place imaginable, our son remained the boy we raised. Robert Sullivan, a man of few words, added something that Chin would never forget. James was always helping injured animals on the farm, always bringing home stray cats, always defending the smaller kids at school. I used to worry that the world would be too hard for a boy with such a soft heart. I never imagined that his soft heart would be exactly what the world needed. The story of James's letter didn't end with the Sullivan family. Chen, inspired by the response he'd received, began sharing the story more widely. He spoke at veterans organizations, at schools, at churches. He always carried photocopies of the letter with him, and he always ended his presentations with the same message every day. We have the choice to be James Sullivan or to be someone else. The circumstances don't matter. What matters is who we choose to be. In 1962, Chin established the James Sullivan Foundation, dedicated to recognizing acts of compassion during times of conflict. The foundation has documented thousands of similar stories from every war since World War II, soldiers who chose kindness over cruelty, who risked their lives to help others, who maintained their humanity in inhuman circumstances. But Chin always insisted that James's story was special not because it was unique, but because it was universal. There are James Sullivans in every war, in every conflict, in every difficult situation. Chin would say, the tragedy is not that they exist, the tragedy is that we don't always hear their stories. Today, James Sullivan's letter is housed in the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where it's read by thousands of visitors every year. But copies of the letter have spread far beyond that museum. It's been translated into dozens of languages, shared on social media millions of times, and has inspired countless acts of kindness around the world. Teachers use James's story to help students understand that heroism isn't just about physical courage, it's about moral courage. Military chaplains share it with soldiers struggling to maintain their humanity in difficult circumstances. Parents read it to children to help them understand that being kind isn't always easy, but it's always important. The little French girl James helped, now a grandmother herself, still keeps the paper airplane he made for her. Klaus Weber, the German soldier James saved, lived to be 89 years old and never stopped telling people about the American who chose compassion over vengeance. Rosa Rodriguez, Tommy's sister, did indeed become the first person in her family to go to college, and she became a teacher. Inspired by her brother's belief in the power of education, Margaret Sullivan lived to be 94 years old, and until the day she died, she would tell anyone who would listen about her son's letter. "People think courage is about charging into battle," she would say, "but real courage is about staying human when everything around you is trying to make you inhuman." The letter has been studied by psychologists trying to understand resilience, by historians trying to understand the human experience of war, and by philosophers trying to understand the nature of goodness. But perhaps the most important readers have been ordinary people facing their own difficult circumstances, who have found in James's words the inspiration to choose kindness when kindness seems impossible. James Sullivan never got to open that garage he dreamed about. He never got to marry Sarah, never got to raise children who would never know war. He never got to take over his father's farm or taste his mother's apple pie again. But through his letter, through his choice to remain human in the face of inhumanity, James Sullivan achieved a different kind of immortality. Every time someone chooses compassion over cruelty, every time someone helps a stranger, every time someone refuses to let darkness win, James Sullivan lives on. His letter reminds us that we don't have to be in a war to be heroes. We just have to choose, every single day, to see the humanity in others and to respond with our own. In a world that often seems determined to divide us, James Sullivan's letter is a reminder that our shared humanity is stronger than our differences. It's a reminder that kindness is not weakness, it's the ultimate form of strength. And it's a reminder that every single one of us has the power to be someone's American angel, someone's reason to keep believing in goodness. If James Sullivan's story touched you the way it's touched millions of others, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded about the power of kindness. And tell me in the comments, what would you want your final letter to say about the person you chose to be? What acts of kindness have you witnessed that restored your faith in humanity? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Because in a world full of darkness, we need to keep sharing the light. And remember, you don't have to be a soldier to be a hero. You just have to choose, every single day, to be kind. Until next time, keep being someone's reason to believe in goodness.